Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in this world. And welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, your moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a really great webinar on tap today, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded. So if you miss any or all of the event, just know you'll be able to watch it on demand. We'll be sending out an email link after the event that will take you right to it. And we are answering audience questions. So if you have a question for either of our panelists today, just use your GoToWebinar control panel, submit your question, and we'll take probably around 10 or 15 minutes near the end of the presentation and go over the audience questions. And finally, we do have 2 polling questions to ask during today's event. So please pay attention. We would love to have you guys participate in those polling questions. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar. When is a deployment actually over? A question I know I've asked in the past, and I know a lot of you guys have asked as well. So we have some really great panelists today, as I've said. First of all, we have Ravi Lachman, who is Technical Evangelist at AppDynamics. And then we also have Aaron Newcomb, who is Senior Product Marketing Manager at AppDynamics. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Charlene. Great to be here. This is Ravi.
Hey.
Yeah, this is Aaron. Thanks for having us. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. All right. Well, Ravi, I know you're going to be taking the lead, so I'm going to go ahead and just turn things over to you and let you guys do your thing.
Absolutely. And I'm super excited to be talking today with DevOps.com. I know I've struggled with this question before, and being summertime, I have some personal anecdotes about when is the deployment actually over, when can I actually go on my weekend instead of being on the hook to revert back. But a few of the topics that we want to talk about today, I think this will help the public in general, is that you don't really have to boil the ocean when working on a release. Be iterative in success. Your success builds on success. Also, something that I always struggled on is defining success before the deployment. Do the features meet the expectations, or vice versa? Does the expectations meet the features? And when going through a very complex release or deployment, one particular strategy doesn't fit all. So you might be using multiple strategies for release and deployment to make sure that your entire deployment is successful. And so before we get started, actually, let's go ahead and go on a journey together. And so I've changed some of the company names around to protect individuals, but we'll be taking a look at a case study for wineforcats.com. So basically what wineforcats.com is, it's the leading website for wine for cats. And so Wine for Cats is a e-commerce site, and they recently received funding. And so they're going to be making a journey from Wine for Cats 1.0 to Wine for Cats 2.0. And so let's take a look at some of the changes that will happen. So very minor change, let's say going down our journey, Wine for Cats 1.0.1 to 1.0.2, so this is right after they received funding. Very minor changes. I mean, the changes are so minor that it might take longer for you to actually edit the version number in your configuration management database than actually to implement the changes. But what could be some of these really small, low-level changes? And so when we're going between very small or minor versions, let's say there were some spelling mistakes, some very small UI tweaks, some very basically low-hanging changes. We're not touching the e-commerce engine, nothing that's too complicated that we have to worry about user affinity. So this is very, very crucial that this particular change is low-hanging. Basically, we modified some JavaScript files, we pushed it out to our content delivery network, hit refresh, and ta-da! It's easy for us to validate that the changes were actually made. There wasn't too much planning that had to go on to define success. Did we misspell cats with a Z with cats with an S? Yes, you hit refresh, it shows up on your screen. Done. That's all the planning that needs to happen. Pretty low barrier to make that change. Now, this might be a topic for another webinar, but what I call the fog of deployment, if there was some inadvertent problem that happened around the same time that you push those changes out, well, that can be a talk for another story. But where does this get really interesting is that there's actually, let's go into another part of the journey. So it's time for us to do our 2.0 deployment. So we're moving from our 1.0 platform to our 2.0 platform. Now we have funding. We really need to start setting up some goals for this. So some of maybe the high-level business goals would be, we want to have a more robust customer experience. We want to be more available. We want to be the premier spot for Wine for Cats in the globe, expanding our regional presence. And so with a major change, in our particular example here, we're going through a kind of two-part changes. One, we're going through a tooling and a platform change. For example, let's say we're introducing a new database, we're introducing Cassandra to the organization, we're expanding our event-driven architecture. Really the point getting across here that there's multiple teams that are involved. And so with multiple teams, this is where it starts getting really tricky, is that who goes first, who goes last. The planning or the analysis process can happen, but there's good reason for doing that, right? So if we have multiple teams, there's something that we're trying to avoid, and this is why we have all sorts of planning. And so what I like to call zero downtime or else. This is the absolute worst case, let's say after a deployment, that you have a deployment, it's out there in the wild, and then something goes wrong as soon as the deployment, from a technical standpoint, is over. What does downtime even look like? So going back to maybe a few years ago, a downtime would be, we can't even access our website. We get a 500 or we get a 404 back. Now, downtimes are viewed as SLA violations. Let's say, because how we build our infrastructure, can be built in such a robust way that, let's say, more likely than not, it might not be a complete failure, but there's an SLA violation. Response times might be lower than your services require. From a business standpoint, if you take a look at what a downtime or SLA violation is, in this case for wineforcats.com, you're not able to take orders. And I always like to say, well, it's a feature, not a bug, right? If we get this particular fail cat back, that's a feature, at least that works, right? So, but the crucial thing about this is planning ahead is defining success ahead of time. And so by defining success ahead of time, we actually have this concept of baseline. So for example, if we say our average response time for wineforgats.com for someone who's in our shopping cart is 500 milliseconds, at least for the next version of that, we want to maintain that, right? And so we want to make sure that the user experience and user expectation is the same. Now, when dealing with multiple pieces, especially with dealing with multiple teams, it's going back to the adage that building incremental success is important, right? So not try to get stuck in analysis paralysis. I've been in situations that we would overanalyze the deployment or overanalyze the release, and it drags on for days at a time, how we have to go plan it, making sure all the particular artifacts there. Really, the core concept is to start small and then start building your way up. And there's multiple deployment strategies that you could have. And now, no one tool or no one methodology fits the bill. Going back to our example here is that there's multiple teams. We're introducing this, to reiterate, we're introducing Cassandra. We're expanding our event-driven architecture. We might have a new data source or even a new integration with an API to, let's say, beerfordogs.com, like our future platform that we're introducing. And so looking at a few methodologies that we have, and really the difference between these methodologies, there are a few questions that we have to ask, right? So some of this might be new, some of this might not be new to some folks on the phone or the webinar, is that, well, if we use a blue-green deployment, the first question we have to ask ourselves is that, do we have available infrastructure to push the changes? Now, given that we have several technologies or several packages that are changing, does it make sense to use a blue-green deployment for partial of this? So for a net new Cassandra database, not really, because it's net new, but maybe for some of our integrations, it might make sense to do that. Canary deployment, again, similar story. Do we have enough infrastructure capacity? And also, does our underlying application infrastructure support this? The main thing is, if we're crossing transaction boundaries or network boundaries, does that deployment suffice for our Canary to be successful? Now, in the Wine for Cats example, and this is going to be the strategy that I take, or that we would take for Wine for Cats, is a 1% test. And so a reason why picking this particular test, for example, is that it really isolates the new users. So it could be a 1% test, a 5% test. I've seen some numbers in between that with various commerce customers or travel customers that I work with. And basically, so the changes are so big that we're going to isolate a set of users to this. And so by isolating a set of users, again, we're not jumbling transactions, we're not crossing those boundaries in a fashion that we can't roll back if something happens. A few other deployment strategies. So again, looking at the underlying technology, let's say we were upgrading our Kafka brokers to the latest version for security fixes. Potentially one part of the infrastructure might be rolling, just understanding how the upgrade process works with that. Also, kill first, kill last, if you're dealing with a container orchestrator, this particular container orchestrator that we're dealing with here, this becomes important. So this is something that I haven't started dealing with since I started dealing with containers or orchestrators, is that if containers are made to be immutable, the particular workflows, you can define that, do I kill the oldest one first, do I kill the youngest one first, and let the orchestrator take care of the updating process. But again, all of this is important to be helping when you start to plan things.
Hey, Aaron, don't want to break in, or sorry, Robbie, I don't want to break in here, but we've got a poll that we need to send out to the audience. So I thought now would be a good time.
Sure.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and launch it here. Where are you on your DevOps journey? So if the audience can go ahead and submit your answer. We'll take a few seconds and let the audience do that. While we're waiting, I do want to remind the audience, if you have a question for Ravi or for Aaron when he does his presentation, please just use your GoToWebinar control panel, submit your question, and we should have some time near the end of the presentation. Okay, looks like we are almost ready to close out the poll. I'm going to go ahead and close it now. Take a look at the results here. Where are you on your DevOps journey? The majority of folks are just learning about it, starting out. So interesting results there. It's a kind of, I think it's indicative of the industry at large. What do you think?
Yeah, same here. I think the DevOps movement has been garnering a lot of speed, a lot of attention over the last couple of years, and it's it's a consistently learning exercise, right? One of the big pillars is that you always have to be learning, and this is very indicative of, I would say, what I've seen in the industry so far.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so as well. And since the majority of folks are either starting out or in mid-journey, I kind of wanted to go back and ask you about those scenarios that you laid out. I mean, are those fairly well defined in terms of, if I'm on a DevOps team, I'm going to be like have those different scenarios in front of me all the time, and I'm going to be picking one? Or do you think that those scenarios are implemented on a case-by-case basis?
Yeah, so I think those scenarios are implemented on a case-by-case basis. So let's go back and take a look at what all the changes that we had to do, let's say. So it's really understanding kind of the two-part, and this is where it gets really complicated, and this is why DevOps is so important, because no one person can answer these questions. It has to do with the infrastructure and the application infrastructure. So when I say infrastructure, that's the physical infrastructure, the server infrastructure, or the cloud infrastructure. And then going back to the application-specific stuff, this is, the Cassandra ring updates in a certain way or gets implemented in a certain way. The Kafka topology gets implemented in a certain way. And so really having to understand that, and without these two teams talking to each other, it would be anybody's guess how things are implemented. I remember just going back in my career, there used to be very lengthy run books that we had, and there was a lot of finger pointing, which really didn't do anybody any favors when there was a problem. So introspecting both of those, and there'll be some crucial things when we go through a little bit more of our journey, Aaron, is that when actually iterating on the big deployment, there's other technical solutions that we can have. But yes, it not one size fits all. And then in the Wine for Cats example, which I'll get into in a minute, that we actually picked a couple of these. But so far, so good with that question.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks.
Yep. So one size doesn't really fit all, right? And so what we're going to see with Wine for Cats is that one size doesn't really fit all. And there's reasons why one size doesn't really fit all. And there's just questions that you have to ask and answer. Some of them will be kind of before, and then some of the questions will be after the deployment. So before the deployment, it really needs to interrogate and investigate the application or the platform. In this case, wineforcats.com. So was there a change in the data model, right? The main thing that we're trying to avoid here, and I think this would be an overarching goal for an e-commerce site, is that we don't want to take an outage, right? So we don't want to have our fail cats come up again. And we want to make sure that, since wineforcats.com runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, is that we want to make sure we have a proper upgrade that doesn't impact our users. That can be a mantra that many people have to deal with. And so if that's an arching goal to have, we want a zero downtime deployment. We really have digging into the application and the platform architecture that you have. So in this case, is our data model so different that a particular transaction or person in flight will be errored out? I'm also starting to gather the bits and pieces for the deployment, right? So how much infrastructure do we have? If you were to go and decide to do a blue-green deployment, basically you're having a replica copy of production in the green replica, right? So the blue is the as is, the green is a to be, a few post-production checks, and then you switch over the infrastructure for the load balancer. That requires double the infrastructure, right, for the change. can you modify something in place? Now, depending on the underlying technology, some technologies have the ability to do a rolling upgrade or update better than other technologies, so really understanding the application specific infrastructure. Could there be a sister install? Same thing with blue-green deployment. Are there breaking API changes? This might be when you start polling. I'm going to switch roles a little bit and be a systems engineer now. You start polling the application owners or platform owners saying, hey, what really is the difference between if we catch a user between 1.0 and 2.0? And then really deciding on the distribution mechanisms, right? So again, deciding on the tooling, do we have this package as infrastructure as code, like a Chef or an Ansible? Do we have the ability to containerize some of the workloads? We're obfuscating some of the complexity with the container orchestrator. Are we implementing additional or repurposing cloud architecture or cloud automation with, let's say, an ARM script or a CloudFormation script? And also just where are the binaries, right? This might seem kind of odd, but even finding the binaries to deploy might be a challenge. I had that challenge before in the artifact repo. And also going back to what's a success look like, how do we not only define the health checks? So there's a part of, let's say, in our wineforcats.com example, we might have health checks on, is the service responding, right? So are we getting a 200 instead of a 500, or are we getting a proper HTTP status code in a certain amount of time? So that's very, very granular. But overall, was a deployment a success? Going back to our first metric, are we able to have a conversion of 500 or a response and a shopping cart experience of 500 milliseconds when you click buy versus when our 1.0 and 2.0 platform? And that's where the health checks get more sophisticated and definitely needing to have some historical baselines. So going back to that is that, again, don't boil the ocean. Incremental success builds on incremental success. Be tactical with the features that you're looking for. Going back to does the features max the expectations, is if you have a particular incremental update or incremental deployment, you can validate this quite quickly. So if you introduce a lot of change, it would be hard to pinpoint exactly where a lot of those changes are. Now let's continue on our journey. So we decided to do a 1% test here, or at wineforcats.com. And the reason why is that there were just so many changes for Wine for Cats, is that it made more sense that there would be a lower risk that if we siphoned off users to completely move them to a new system, right? So 1% of the users get our 2.0 platform, the other 99% gets the 1.0.2, which I think was the last version of wineforcats.com. But now this leads to the next question. What about the rest of the users, right? So what about the other 99% of our faithful users at wineforcats.com? And going back to one of the original goals is that we want to have a zero downtime deployment. How do we actually accomplish this, right? And so the big piece for this would be actually connection draining. And so connection draining can happen in a lot of separate pieces, right? So with particular connection draining, basically what a connection drain is, it's allowing in-flight transactions to complete and then siphoning off the unhealthy ones or new ones and rerouting them. So with a connection drain, there's a couple of places you can implement this. And this is why having a DevOps team is so important, because you can have, I'm going to use the Amazon specific infrastructure on your EC2 or Elastic Load Balancer. You can set, let's say, a connection drain for one of the instances. I'm going to make some number up here, 300 seconds or 5 minutes. If someone's in flight, move them off, versus when really charting this out with transaction boundaries, at what point does, if a user crosses over a threshold, that their transaction is no longer valid? And so looking at the infrastructure, let's say that we're using an application server right at the back end, does that transaction boundary, does that connection drain make sense for also the piece of application infrastructure? So a lot of times what I typically see is that the connection drain timeout is longer on the infrastructure and shorter on the application infrastructure, just because we're trying to avoid that scenario that, hey, one hand's not talking to the next. And really how you accomplish. Oh, go ahead.
Hey, Rob, I couldn't help but break in here. What happens if you're having a problem along the way? If you're using connection draining, I mean, what happens if you're having a problem at one specific point in the infrastructure? How do you deal with that when you're trying to implement this?
Yeah, so it gets really challenging to say where exactly it happens. So before you implement connection draining, there would be, what I would do is that we would have to test this out in an environment. So you would actually kind of mock a MIDI test or a MIDI migration. And so you can actually kind of start to chart out exactly where some of the pain points are, and you try to alleviate that. I mean, taking your question a step further, if there was a problem in production, so let's say There was the mocks all went well, the stage migration worked a couple days before, and you figured all the pain points. It really starts to get complicated that you really have to figure out, okay, is one of the timeout settings too short, right? And so are we inadvertently siphoning somebody off too quickly? Or is something else going on? And so really having proper monitoring, proper profiling in place is really important for that. And really understanding the entire transaction, right? So playing devil's advocate, a lot of my background has been in development and app architecture. It's something hard for me, even as an app owner, to plan for is, what if, there's a failure that happens kind of midway, the old chaos monkey theory, right? If a failure happened midway, that could be a systematically induced failure too, if you have a connection drain that triggers and it was, the transaction was not in place, but without having proper tracing or profiling, it would be very, very hard there, and for me to figure out why a transaction stopped midway. Just going back to our kind of the main reason of the talk here is that when is the deployment actually over, right? So when was it actually over? Was your question? Or yep. So when is a deployment actually over? So going back to our overarching goal, hey, were we able to our initial baseline of 500 milliseconds, let's say, for us checking out a particular item in wineforcats.com, was that met when we roll to version 2.0, right? And we might have more granular metrics. Where this hits home for me, I remember I used to work for an investment bank, and we did we had a few deployments that we were running on Fridays, and really from a technical standpoint, when we would roll versions of our particular product that we were supporting for the bank, they would go off without a hitch, but really we didn't start seeing issues typically until maybe a day later or a day or two later in terms of memory leaks, that when additional usage comes on the weekend, we really didn't understand why this was happening. And so the judgment call for go and no go would be pushed out until the following Monday, right? So we might technically be done with the deployment, but from a business standpoint, they wouldn't sign off on the deployment from a risk standpoint until the following Monday. And so really that, one hand again wasn't talking to the other. Having, it used to cause me a lot of angst to say, well, as an application owner, I know if the application is responding, it's up, right? And then from a business standpoint, well, it's kind of slow. So people are complaining, they're having trouble inputting data on their phones, and that can be problematic. But again, really knowing when a deployment's over, and even looking at the number of deployments are on the rise now. So that's our situation was we were starting to migrate to a more microservices architecture, that the sheer number of deployments were increasing, right? So my job of deploying as application owner was increasing over and over again. It's like, oh, not only are we deploying on Fridays, we're deploying on Wednesdays also. And so with that, it's really having to come back and determine what the success actually look like. So for wineforcats.com, success here would have been a 1% test. There are 1% tests match the features that for the 1% test match expectations, again, that 500 millisecond number. And also with all the advent to CI/CD is that we can get out deployments faster than ever now. So you can succeed faster and also roll back faster. So with all that advancement that teams are making in dev tooling and CI/CD, we can't wait to get out the next deployment, right? So even before one deployment's over, we might have another release candidate. There's a few tools that I want to call out.
Hey Ravi, I just got a quick question for you before you go forward, and then I think we have another poll actually. So my question is, in terms of measuring success, are teams also being measured on this particular criteria of having faster deployments? In other words, are DevOps teams being seen as successful or failing when they either do these deployments successfully or not? That's number one. I think it's a kind of an obvious question. But then also you mentioned scope creep and things like that in terms of deployment and keeping things simple. I mean, is that going to help them meet their objectives when it comes to if they have? I mean, this is the catch-22 here, whether they have an actually release frequency metric that they're measuring, or if they're being gold on that or not. But is this actually something that can help them meet deployment goals for DevOps teams?
Yeah, I think I might take a middle ground stance on that question, Aaron. So if you're looking at like a very traditional DevOps team, I would say a dev tooling team that the primary focus might be keeping the tooling available and having flexible tooling for the development teams to have in place. Once the pipeline is healthy, so our Jenkins pipeline is healthy, or pick your CI/CD infrastructure is healthy, and we have available infrastructure and capacity, it's seen as a win for the DevOps team, right? The emphasis might come back to the development team and say, oh, you know what? It's if using modern development practices and say a forward-thinking development team, if they're metric on how fast you can make a change, right? In this case, maybe one of the overarching goals for Wine for Cats 2.0 is that they want increased development or deployment velocity. Like instead of deploying once a week, we want to be able to kind of nirvana state that anytime someone commits code, it's a release candidate, right? So anytime code is committed, we could potentially have a release candidate. And so going back to metrics, what I've seen, or even I've been implemented or been bonused under, would be uptime, right? So is the application up? Are we garnering the changes that we need? More so now, it's what I've seen in the industry is that even matching those SLAs, right? It's like, oh, you know what, we have a certain level of conversion we need to get to with our customers, or even a certain level of sentiment, and a lot of that is technology driving it. And so I think it's definitely the two teams have to work together. The DevOps teams have the ability to push the pipeline when needed, and also have the ability to revert and be kind of the gatekeepers of the production systems, and then the development teams actually making sure the applications are up to par. Did that make sense, Aaron?
Yeah, totally. So keep your deployment scope down so you don't risk causing a problem that's going to basically impact your SLAs.
Yeah, absolutely. And smaller pieces build incremental success. Like that's one thing that it took me a long time in career to figure that out. Is that because usually you want to do, going back to how it's Friday, I got to fly out and go somewhere to the beach, is I don't want to deal with more than one deployment to. The older I am now, it's like, you know what, let's just do a lot of smaller deployments and just build incremental success so we have a good idea of how this feature handled. I think a lot of software methodologies are moving towards that too.
Great.
Cool.
So we do have another polling question I would like to go ahead and push out if you guys are cool with that.
Yep.
Go ahead and push it out now. How many of you practice this type of planning for success ahead of time? All right, there it is. Go ahead and make your selection. And again, just a quick note that we are taking audience questions at the end of this presentation. So if you have a question for Ravi or for Aaron, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and we will get to the questions. Okay, we are just about ready to close out the webinar, or sorry, not the webinar, the poll. Okay, we're closing it out now. And here are the results. How many of you practice this type of planning for success ahead of time? Somewhat. Sounds like we have some part-time procrastinators out there. I don't know. What do you think, Ravi?
Yeah, this is what I would say. It's indicative of the marketplace. Also, I moved from a stern no like 4 or 5 years ago to I wish I did to have certain metrics. I think now as I get better with the craft, moving towards a yes, this type of planning is important. So it's great that the community is moving forward, and there's definitely tools that can help with this out there, right? And having business and technical alignment is also crucial.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'll let you get back to it now.
Thanks. And so there's a few tools that I want to point out that's been gaining a lot of traction, what I've seen in the industry. And so one of those tools is called Spinnaker. And so Spinnaker, it hails from Netflix. And what's different about Spinnaker is a CI/CD tool, but what Spinnaker does is a little bit different, say, than the traditional competition like Jenkins would be, is that Spinnaker takes in the underlying infrastructure into account when you're building something. And so what I've seen, at least from my professional deployments or from an engineering standpoint, is that let's say we were deploying to a public cloud, we would pre-stage a lot of the instances before the deployment. So we might say, you know what, at 8 o'clock in the morning, let's validate that our n number of cloud compute instances are up and running. And then at 2 p.m. we're going to start the deployment, right? So everything is there ahead of time. But a lot of the tooling and really taking advantage of Elastic Cloud and spot pricing, and you're trying to optimize cloud cost, is that as part of your deployment, you're actually provisioning infrastructure. And so the Spinnaker project actually takes that into account. So if a particular piece of infrastructure wasn't there, it would actually take that into account and help shape the deployment in a certain way. So, we'll fail a deployment if, let's say, the health check and see what's instant come up. And so that would be something pretty cool and actually baked into your pipeline in a codified way. Another really neat platform that I've seen in the community that's been coming up is called Harness, or Harness.io. So Harness.io is spiel is that they're a CI/CD as a service, and they include the magic of machine learning into your CI/CD process. And so some other non-functional requirements that might be prudent, for example, security, they can help learn to help implement those prepackaged policies for you when you're deploying. Also, another way, what Harness is, a lot of what we talked about earlier, let's say performance validation, so going back to, did we deploy in version 1, 500 milliseconds for cart conversion, versus version 2, Harness can actually take into account those baselines. So I think it's really neat. 2 stellar projects that folks can look at, and if you take a look at the presentation, links will be in the description for the presentation. So with that, going to hand it over to my colleague Aaron to start talking about a little bit more about SLIs and SLOs and how they play a part of this whole picture that we're talking about.
Yeah, so I wanted to continue the discussion a little bit and talk about some of the ways that we think, at least from an AppDynamics standpoint, we can actually help deliver on some of the DevOps initiatives that everyone's working on, and specifically how it connects to all the things that Ravi just laid out. And one of those, I think one of the more obvious ones is making sure that you're grabbing the right SLIs, that you know what those are, and then turning those into the right SLOs, ultimately into SLAs that you're going to agree to commit to your end users or customers on. And AppDynamics can help with this in a lot of different ways. So one of the things that we do, for example, out of the box is we auto-instrument your applications, and not just your applications, but anything that really touches those applications, anywhere where your transaction goes, we can actually instrument that and give you a view kind of like this one, although it can be painted, if you will, in a lot of different ways. This is kind of a spoken hub kind of methodology, but basically what you're looking at is, hey, everything's green across the board. I can see what my transaction rates are going back and forth between different services. And not only can we do this for the application, but we can do it for the business at the business level as well. And that's where we get into trying to find what those SLIs and SLOs are, right? Because it's not always a certain transaction time to a particular database that you're getting measured on. Sometimes it's performance in terms of, you know, how fast can you put something into somebody's cart in your application or what have you. So you know, what's the uptime obviously is an obvious one, and other things. But we can actually help you paint that picture and find out exactly what's going on. And not only that, but we can automatically instrument baselines, error rates, metrics, and events to basically help you determine what those SLIs and SLOs should be in the first place, so that you get those right out of the box, and hopefully you come up with an SLA that actually meets your expectations as well as your end user's expectations. Next slide. So the other thing we can help with for sure is reducing the mean time to resolution when you do have a problem. And Ravi talked about this earlier, which is kind of the finger pointing approach or the blame game approach when it comes to why is this happening? Why is this thing failing? Why is it going wrong? How do we get to root cause, right? And you have a lot of different teams that are actually pointing fingers at each other and saying, hey, it's a poorly written SQL query, or hey, your application code isn't written efficiently enough, or what have you. And we can actually pinpoint those problems down to the actual SQL statement or down to the actual line of code, and then everyone can get around the table and agree, because it's there in plain view in front of you, that this is exactly what's going on at this particular point in my with your application. Allscripts is a good example of this. When they implemented AppDynamics, one of the big benefits that they saw is that they could all take a look at a single dashboard and agree based on empirical evidence that this is exactly what's going on and this is what we need to go address. So the dev team specifically weren't getting different conflicting messages from their DBAs or from their SREs that this or that or the other thing was going wrong. They could actually look at it together and say, no, it's obvious. This is the thing that's happening. Now we need to go put together a plan to fix it. Next slide. You're my Vanna, Ravi, by the way. You got some of these slides along.
Glad to help.
The other way we can help is decrease failure rate. And there's lots of different ways that we can actually do that. I talked before about automatic baselining. That can really help detect abnormal trends when your application is doing something somewhere along the life cycle of that transaction that's out of the norm. Maybe it's something's moving too slow where all along it was moving just fine. And we can actually help you elevate and find those particular examples of something going a little wonky ahead of time before it starts impacting your end users or your customers. And so at the end of the day, you're able to detect that, fix it, hopefully before there's a problem. The other thing that we do in terms of failure rates is we take snapshots when things go wrong. We take detailed snapshots of exactly what's going on in your application. And that really helps you drill in and focus on the particular time frame that's involved with a particular problem and get to that root cause quicker. And the other thing that we do actually is we offer synthetics capabilities to help you do constant testing as you're increasing your release velocity and you're doing things faster. It's really important to be able to have constant testing to make sure that everything's working. And so we have tools to help you do that as well. Next slide. Another big problem that we see is reducing lead time. So we talked about focusing down on a particular change that we want to make. That'll certainly help. But there's other ways that we can do that too. When you're in your testing cycle, for example, you may have a situation like the one you see on the screen where we've reduced the response time like by 50% and everyone's all happy initially. And they say, wow, that's fantastic. I can't believe we did that. But the end result of that is that we actually introduced an increased error rate for a lot of the transactions. And so by doing one thing, we impacted another part of the application. And so we help you surface that immediately so that you can get that fixed before, so that your lead time is reduced so that you can get those changes pushed out in production more quickly. And last but not least, we talked about release frequency a couple of times, and I know that for a lot of people, especially upper management, when they hear about DevOps, the reason they want to go with DevOps is because they think that they can release code more quicker, and that's going to help them gain maybe a competitive advantage over competition or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why you want to increase your release frequency, but sometimes that gets a little bit overblown. But a lot of times you are judged on that regardless, right? Management is expecting, hey, we just implemented this DevOps team. We're expecting this to happen because that's what everybody tells us. This is the reason everybody says you want to move to DevOps. So that becomes really difficult actually when you consider that you're probably, along with this, you're probably also maybe moving to the cloud. Your environments are becoming much more dynamic because you're using containers to spin things up and spin things down. So you really actually do need some sort of tool, whether it's AppDynamics or otherwise, to be able to automatically instrument as you're doing your deployments so that you can see right away when something's working and when something's not. We also integrate with lots of deployment tools like Puppet, Chef, Jenkins, basically we try to integrate with everything that you're going to use to try to get a handle on your environments. And then we also proactively alert when things go wrong to be able to make sure that you understand what's going on in your environment, and hopefully develop a mindset of being able to scope your changes effectively so that over time this becomes, the learning gets distributed across multiple teams, and you have fewer and fewer problems moving forward. And the last thing I would say is that we also give you tools that you can use like dashboards to actually prove to upper management or to the business unit that what you're doing in your journey to DevOps or throughout your application life cycle, if you will, or the life of the application, that the methodology that you're implementing is actually working. So you can go back and you can say, no, look, our release frequency is increasing and our error rate or our failure rate over time is decreasing, hopefully, right? That's the goal that we all have in mind. So with that, I'll turn it back to Ravi to wrap up.
Yep, and thanks, Aaron, for that. I think that's all really great pieces of advice, and I think we're getting pretty close to wrapping up here. But what did we just learn on the journey that we went on? If I could leave folks with any piece of advice, at least for my career, is that try not to boil the ocean. Having more releases or deployments is not a bad thing, right? And so even might bring up this point a little bit late, but going back for the Wine for Cats, 1.0 to 2.0, you might actually have a lot of subsequent releases because you're trying to make sure that if your data models have changed or your APIs have changed so much that you have to get someone into an intermediate state. that you need more increments to get to that future state, right? So don't boil the ocean. Take small successes where you can. Also, this again, define success before the deployment, right? So a lot of what Aaron and I mentioned, it's just that. There's something that I was challenged with a lot, especially when I used to work for a bank I used to work for. I wish we had a solution like Apti in there. We had a lot of alerting, being as an aside, I was thinking about ways how to disable Nagios when I was working there because I used to ruin some of my weekends, get alerted to something, right? So it's crucial to do that. And then also, one deployment strategy doesn't fit all. As we start to work on more and more distributed workloads and distributed systems, is that each one of the pieces of infrastructure, let it be from a cloud provider or let it be application provider or database provider, each one of those pieces of infrastructure cluster and distribute and replicate in different ways. And so one strategy might not fit the entire strategy for your deployment or even upgrade or maintenance needs to happen. So really, go forth, be successful. Don't be afraid to experiment and try multiple things. Don't be pigeonholed to one deployment methodology. Use several if that makes the case. So with that, I'm not sure if we have time to answer if there's a question from the audience or anything's been coming up.
One more thing, Ravi, to throw in. I just realized this. If nothing else, if you don't take anything else away from this session, at your next team meeting, just bring up this question, right? When do we actually know that a deployment is over? How do we actually know that? And just bring it up and see what the response is. It's going to be a great conversation starter in your next team meeting for sure.
We know the following week when there's no, when the users are in there, right? How about no? How about no now? Yeah.
All right, great. Well, we've gotten some great audience questions in so far, but there's plenty of time. If you have a question for Ravi or for Aaron, please go ahead and use your control panel, submit your question, and we'll go ahead and get started with them. The first question, on the case study you mentioned, Ravi, what was the production deployment success percent when the 1% testing was done?
So in that particular case, it took a couple iterations to do the 1% test. And so there's the actual 1% test without users, and then there's actually the 1% test with users. And so it took us 2 or 3 iterations to get the entire system at least at an idle state running, because again, there were several teams that were involved. So this is it's for a travel company. And so it took us several iterations to get that. And once we got the 1% test in there, it was very, very telling for how the production system at the end state would be. So I would say it took 2 or 3 iterations to get it all deployed properly without users. And then it really was like more of a sandbox environment for stress testing, like real life perf testing. Some of the original numbers were too high for us in terms of, hey, there's a lot of resources being used, but it really built a lot of confidence that if 1% can work, we're on a clear path to get 100% users.
Okay. All right, great. The next question, our company is shifting toward DevOps, but is still practicing traditional application development right now. Could you or would you use this in a more traditional environment?
I think there's, with DevOps, it's such a big term, I think. It's really looking at the goals that you have. So looking at a traditional model, right? It's traditional being waterfall development, that you have to be completely done to try something, and then if you hand it off to a separate team, the team structures are pretty siloed. But again, there's that particular traditional team, you're probably practicing some DevOps practices and you don't even know it. So don't get pigeonholed to the terminology. Really, you can start doing some stuff right away, especially around joint determination. This is what success looks like. Does it even make sense for us to have an increased velocity? I've worked at projects that it didn't, especially when my federal days, we were working on fairly large integrations, and it was, we had to go waterfall to make sure all the requirements are there before we put stuff in the prod. So definitely little steps you can take. I'm just suggesting, if whoever that answered or asked that question, there's a movement called DevOps Days. So if you go to devopsdays.org, they have a lot of local meetups in local cities across the world, and that's an awesome way to start learning. So I'm a big fan of DevOps Days, especially in the cities where I live in. So strongly suggest going to take a look at those resources, and DevOps.com also.
Right.
The other thing I'd mention in addition to that, in terms of traditional development methodologies, is a lot of times you still have a beta test, or alpha beta stage, and you can implement some of these things in the beta stages, right? Because you're not throwing the code out over the fence on the CD for everybody to download yet. So you can actually implement some of these things, and it's kind of a gateway in some respects to moving towards DevOps. Is if you're able to do beta, even in traditional application development. If you're using more traditional methodologies, you can use that beta period and start doing these things there, and then you can move that muscle memory, if you will, into your DevOps teams as time goes on.
Good point. Okay, if we're going to do a shameless plug, I would like to actually do a shameless plug for the DevOps Experience online event that DevOps.com is hosting on September 20th, and you can check out the information on that on our DevOps.com website. Okay, moving rapidly along here. The next question, if we need to have a zero downtime deployment, what deployment model should we use?
So I can take that question. So that's actually it's really depends on the workloads that you have, right? So it's really introspecting what your application or platforms that you're supporting are doing. Now, it's going to be a two-part argument. If you're upgrading tools that you buy from a vendor, the vendor will give you some sort of prescription to kind of match or get closer to that. Now, let's say if you're the app architect or app owner for wineforcats.com, so someone either got promoted or demoted depending on how they view wine for cats. But it's really taking piece by piece by piece, and it takes a lot of teams to understand what's going on. I mean, some of the tricky parts is we want a zero downtime deployment with, we take transactions in flight. That's like kind of the worst case scenario for complexity. It's the first thing is the data model, right? So looking at, if someone comes in our 1.0 version of the site, are they incompatible with 2.0? And a lot of times what ends up happening is you deprecate the 1.0 APIs and you're not really fully off 1.0 until like 2.5 or something like that, right? Or close to 3.0 because you're making incremental changes to handle both APIs. Connection draining is an important part of that from an infrastructure standpoint. So zero downtime, most people will implement some sort of connection drain to make sure that the in-flight transactions or in-flight users are unimpacted. But if you want a true zero downtime, it might be, you would have to double up on the infrastructure, right? So either completely allowing some subset of users to be on the next system, or I would say a blue-green deployment, which you know that the infrastructure is isolated. But again, that's pretty infrastructure heavy. If you're dealing with thousands of servers and you need to have another set of thousands of servers to make a production change, that could be problematic. But there are businesses that are not critical. Right? So again, it's not just interrogate the workloads, kind of understand what each part of the moving pieces are, and then make the best judgment call each one of those pieces.
Okay, great. Our next question regarding the App Dynamics monitoring tools. Do these tools integrate with PagerDuty, ServiceNow, or other alerting ticketing tools? And if so, is the integration done through the APIs? And if not, are there plans for future?
Yeah, I can take that one. So the short answer is yes. We do integrate with most of them. I don't have the full list in front of me, but we do integrate with most of them. And the great thing about App Dynamics is, I've seen this over the short time that I've been here, is if you have a specific need for a specific tool, there are almost always a way to integrate with those. It may not be automatic, but there are APIs or SDK toolkits you can use to actually integrate with a one-off type of tool like that. But most of your most popular alerting tools that you'd be using on a regular basis, Jira, PagerDuty, et cetera, are actually already integrated, so you don't have to do that work ahead of time.
We also have a marketplace too, Aaron. So just
yes.
For education sake, yeah, like if we have a pretty good from an employee and community contributed marketplace. And so if there's features out there that a particular enterprise needs or you need as an end user, we definitely have an SDK for you to build reporting metrics and integrations to and from.
All right. Great. Just a reminder to the audience, there's still time. If you have a question, go ahead and send it in. We'll just keep going along until we stop. Next question, how useful are runbooks nowadays as deployments are coming in faster? And when should a runbook be updated?
I can take that question. So a lot of what's happening to runbooks are becoming codified, right? So your runbook is a chef recipe, a Puppet manifest, an Ansible script, right? So they're becoming codified. Now, if you take a look at a traditional, I would say, the 150 step run book, let's say to get, an application from one version to the next. When I use run books that were not infrastructure as code, right? So this is going back 2008, 2009. They need to be updated every time you deploy, right? And so it's up to as part of a dev team or app owner, we would validate the run book before we hand it to the operations team. So that's, the operations team all we would have to do is to make our binaries, check them into an artifact repo, then have that available to the system engineer or release engineer that's actually doing the deployment. But we would take the emphasis on the dev team to run through the run book ourselves. And so it should be validated every time there's a deployment. If not, if there's small deployments or you're doing maintenance, let's say if your project is still using a run book, if there's a maintenance emergency, right? So all the releases are in maintenance, it might not be as prudent to run through the entire run book if it's like a patch or a fix. But if there's a new feature being developed, absolutely you need to update the run book.
Isn't that also a feature though, Ravi, of like doing incremental deploys or smaller deploys? Is that the amount that you have to change in the run book is also smaller, and you're less likely to forget and leave something out.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, like if you had to go back and write like another 150 steps, I've been accused, and it's true, I miss stuff, like I'm human, right? So I might have had 140 out of 150 steps. Because the big thing with the run books is also very subjective, right? It's like, oh, I know how to do it because I built this application on my laptop, and I know every step to see the database and every step to configure the message broker. And why doesn't the system engineer know this, right? So you're absolutely right. The more times you do it, it just gets incrementally better. It can be applied to a lot of stuff in tech. So yep.
All right, great. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Next question here, how does security fit into all of this? It wasn't actually mentioned too much during the presentation, so. Yeah,
I can take that question too. So there's also a subsequent movement called DevSecOps, right? And so security is utmost important. This is going to be this will be off topic for our conversation, but something I'm really also passionate about is the SecOps. So the big mantra is shifting everything left, right? So if you look at an organization, there's a reason why security used to be an afterthought. So let's pretend all of us on the phone here are on a team, and one person out of, let's say, the number of attendees is a AppSec professional. So immediately they're outnumbered, 50 to 1 from engineers to AppSec engineer, right? And so it's impossible for that one AppSec person to scale across the teams. And now a lot of what I've seen, especially in the last year, and this is fairly new, is that a lot of development tooling, security tooling has been shifting left. So from terms of inception to deployment to monitoring, security is a big focus, right? Your brand's at stake. If we introduce change that causes an outage, shame on us, right? That's why we have all those decisions up front. But if there's a security breach, your brand could be, you could be DDoSed, or even worse, you could be hacked and get crucial information. And so it's also of utmost importance, right? So I would assume that being secure would be kind of a given. So like part of a non-functional requirement said, yes, we get that it's secure. Our security policies are not changing, but there are changes in that shifted to the left.
Okay, great. All right, let's see. Next question. I work for a mid-sized company with a limited budget, and we can't afford to monitor every application. So what should we prioritize?
I can take that, or Aaron, you can take it. Which one?
Why don't you start, and I'll follow up.
Absolutely. So if it becomes tribal or internal knowledge of your applications. I mean, it's taking a little bit of a business spin on it. Is how critical is each application to your day-to-day business, right? Or even more so. It's very interesting. I was actually on a call about a week ago with a local municipality, and they were maintaining applications that help dispatch the police officers, right, in their city. And so just that level of criticality, just having that knowledge of that, what if someone can't pay their garbage bill online, okay, they'll pay later. But if someone calls 911 and you can't get an officer dispatched during an emergency, that's a very critical application. So I would say categorizing your applications. Most people do it either tier 1, 2, 3, or the old metal, platinum, gold, silver analogy to when you determine the level of cruciality of the application or impact that it has if it was out to attach to a perf monitoring or a monitoring solution. So that's my stance on it. Just prioritize.
Yeah, I think my answer is going to be fairly similar, which is, determine the applications that have the most business impact, the most user impact, and then monitor those. But don't just monitor the production application. If you have a dev environment or something like that, monitor that as well. Make sure that you're doing the testing that I mentioned earlier that support those applications, because it's one thing to just say we're going to monitor a production app and know when it goes down. Lots of people can do that, but you want to be able to actually prevent it from going down and know when your deployment is going to impact it and be able to correct the problem before you actually do the deployment. So I would say, those two factors, right? One is, business impact. The other is end user impact. And not just go, but don't just go by the application that's most popular, right, in-house either. Like, you really have to get down to those metrics and figure out which ones are the most impactful, and start with those.
All right, great. Well, unfortunately, that's about all the time we have for questions. So I do want to thank the audience for submitting questions. If we didn't get to yours, please know that Ravi and Aaron will be receiving a copy of all of the questions that came in, and either they or somebody from their organization will be more than happy to follow up with you post-event. I also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, you will be able to access the webinar on demand. Shortly after the webinar, we're going to be sending out an email that will have a link to the webinar on demand. It's also going to be living on the DevOps.com website, so you can always go to that place, the DevOps.com website. Click on the webinar panel. There are two tabs, one for on demand, one for upcoming. It'll be listed on the on demand section, and while you're there, just take a look around at all of the other webinars that we have listed. Hopefully there'll be one or two that pique your interest. Ravi Lachman, Aaron Newcomb, thank you both for taking the time and giving such a great presentation. I know I got a lot out of it, and I hope the audience did as well. So thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you very much.
And awesome questions from the audience, and looking forward to interacting with people. You can get to Aaron and I on Twitter at AppDynamics. If you have any questions, feel free to post it there and interact with us more directly. But yeah, super thanks.
Awesome. I believe you had a slide also that had some resources on it. You want to go ahead and post that up?
Oh yeah. This will be available.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So yeah, everybody will be as part of the follow-up will be receiving a copy of the slides as well. So they'll be getting this information. But again, to everybody who joined, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. And this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off today. Have a great day, everybody.